I moved into Willow Creek Estates thinking I'd finally found the perfect suburban sanctuary. The neighborhood was pristine, with manicured lawns and matching mailboxes that spoke of order and community pride. What I didn't anticipate was Karen Pembridge, our H.O.A. president, who treated the Homeowners Association like her personal kingdom, and every resident like a potential subject to be disciplined. My first encounter with Karen happened 3 days after I moved in. I was unpacking boxes on my front porch when she appeared at my driveway, clipboard in hand, wearing a powder blue blazer that screamed middle management authority. "Hello there. I'm Karen Pembridge, H.O.A. president. I noticed you haven't submitted your landscape compliance form yet. It was due yesterday." Her smile was as artificial as the plastic flowers adorning her own perfectly regulation front yard. I apologized and explained that I hadn't received any forms yet, but Karen's expression suggested this was a personal affront rather than an administrative oversight. Well, ignorance of H.O.A. regulations isn't an excuse. The covenant clearly states all new residents must submit landscaping plans within 72 hours of occupancy. That's 3 days in case you need clarification. She handed me a thick packet of papers with the smugness of someone who just delivered a devastating legal blow. That evening, I reviewed the H.O.A. documents more carefully than I'd initially planned. Willow Creek Estates operated under some of the most restrictive covenants I'd ever encountered. Grass height couldn't exceed 2.5 inches. Mailbox colors were limited to 3 approved shades of beige. Even outdoor Christmas decorations required written approval by November 1st, and heaven help anyone who left them up past January 15th. Over the following weeks, Karen's presence became a constant source of neighborhood tension. She prowled the streets like a suburban sheriff, measuring grass with a ruler, photographing minor infractions, and leaving violation notices that bordered on the absurd. Mrs. Henderson received a citation because her garden gnome was 6 inches taller than the regulation 12-inch maximum. The Johnsons got fined because their welcome mat was burgundy instead of an approved neutral tone. My own infractions began accumulating despite my careful attention to the rules. Karen cited me for having my garage door open past 8 p.m. while I was organizing storage boxes. The covenant clearly states garage doors must remain closed except during active vehicular entry or exit. This isn't a warehouse district. She measured my fence and claimed it exceeded the maximum height by 1/2 inch, though 3 separate contractors confirmed it met specifications perfectly. The breaking point came when Karen decided my home office violated residential zoning restrictions. I'd been running a quiet consulting practice from my study, handling corporate strategy for technology companies. No clients visited my home, no signage advertised my business, and my work generated 0 neighborhood impact. But Karen had somehow discovered my professional activities and was determined to make them a federal case. "I have evidence that you're operating an illegal commercial enterprise from your residence," she announced during an emergency H.O.A. board meeting she called specifically to address my supposed violation. The covenant strictly prohibits business activities that generate income from residential properties. This is a family neighborhood, not a strip mall. She prepared a presentation complete with printed screenshots from my company website and what appeared to be surveillance photos of delivery trucks that had visited my street. I explained that my work was entirely digital and complied with all municipal home office regulations, but Karen was unmoved. Rules are rules. If we start making exceptions for every resident who thinks they're special, we'll have complete chaos. Food trucks, retail sales, who knows what other commercial activities will follow. The other board members looked uncomfortable but seemed intimidated by Karen's conviction and her thick folder of documentation. When Karen announced her intention to pursue legal action to force my compliance or eviction, I realized reasonable discourse had reached its limits. She crossed from petty harassment into serious threats against my livelihood and housing security. "I've contacted our association attorney and the county zoning office. If you don't cease your illegal business operations immediately, we'll pursue all available legal remedies including forced sale of your property." Her delivery was triumphant, as if she just announced victory in a major campaign. That weekend, I made some phone calls to colleagues from my previous career in municipal finance. Before launching my consulting practice, I'd spent 15 years working with city governments on bond issues and development projects. Those relationships had remained strong, and several former associates now held significant positions in local government and real estate development. My conversation with David Chan proved particularly enlightening. David had become the county's senior development coordinator, and we'd maintained our friendship through quarterly golf games and occasional business referrals. When I mentioned Willow Creek Estates and its aggressive H.O.A. enforcement, David's response was immediate and informed. "Oh, Willow Creek. Yeah, we've had multiple complaints about that H.O.A. They're notorious for overreach, and honestly, they're skating on thin ice with some of their interpretation of covenant authority." David explained that several Willow Creek residents had filed complaints with the county about H.O.A. harassment, but most lacked the resources or knowledge to pursue formal challenges. More interesting was his revelation about the development's original zoning and the specific legal framework governing H.O.A. authority in our jurisdiction. The thing about homeowner associations is they derive their power from state statutes and recorded covenants. But when they exceed their legal authority or violate due process requirements, they become vulnerable to significant liability. My next call went to Rebecca Martinez, a real estate attorney who'd worked on several of my previous consulting projects. Rebecca specialized in covenant enforcement and H.O.A. governance, and she'd seen cases like mine numerous times. When I described Karen's threats and tactics, Rebecca's interest was immediately piqued. "What you're describing sounds like a clear case of selective enforcement and potential harassment. HOAs can't arbitrarily target individual residents or exceed their covenant authority. There are specific procedures they must follow, and it sounds like this president is ignoring most of them." Rebecca agreed to review my situation pro bono, given our professional relationship and her stated interest in HOA accountability cases. Within days, she'd identified multiple procedural violations in Karen's enforcement actions. The emergency board meeting hadn't followed proper notice requirements. Karen's investigation of my business activities exceeded HOA authority and potentially violated privacy laws. Most significantly, the association had been imposing fines and threatening legal action without following the dispute resolution procedures mandated by state law. Armed with Rebecca's analysis, I requested a formal hearing before the full HOA board to address Karen's accusations. This was my right under both the covenants and state statutes, though Karen seemed surprised and irritated by my knowledge of proper procedures. "Fine, if you want to waste everyone's time with technicalities, we'll schedule your hearing. But don't expect special treatment just because you can quote legal jargon." Her confidence suggested she viewed this as another opportunity to demonstrate her authority, rather than a serious challenge to her position. The hearing took place on a Thursday evening in the community center, with all 5 board members present plus about a dozen curious residents. Karen had prepared another elaborate presentation, complete with photographs, documentation, and what she claimed was expert analysis of zoning violations. She spoke for nearly 30 minutes, describing my home office as a threat to neighborhood character and property values. When my turn came to respond, I presented Rebecca's legal analysis calmly and systematically. I demonstrated that Karen's investigation had exceeded HOA authority, that proper enforcement procedures hadn't been followed, and that my work activities were explicitly protected under both municipal regulations and state law. More importantly, I documented a pattern of selective enforcement and harassment that violated my rights as a homeowner and HOA member. The other board members asked pointed questions that revealed their growing discomfort with Karen's methods. They hadn't authorized her investigation of my business activities. They weren't aware that state law required specific procedures for covenant enforcement. Most telling was their reaction when I presented evidence of Karen's surveillance activities, including photographs of my home taken from public areas at various times of day. Karen's response was predictably defensive and increasingly hostile. This is exactly what I expected from someone trying to dodge accountability. Throw around legal terminology, make threats, try to intimidate the board into ignoring clear covenant violations. But her bluster couldn't address the substantive legal issues Rebecca had identified, and the other board members were obviously reconsidering their support for Karen's crusade. The board voted to dismiss all pending violations against me, and to suspend further enforcement actions pending a comprehensive review of HOA procedures. Karen was visibly furious but couldn't override the 4-to-1 vote. This sets a dangerous precedent. If we don't enforce our covenants consistently, We'll have complete chaos in 6 months. Her dire predictions fell flat with board members who were now questioning whether consistent enforcement had ever been Karen's actual goal. I thought this resolution would end our conflict, but Karen's reaction proved I'd underestimated her commitment to control and retribution. Within days of the board's decision, she launched what could only be described as a systematic harassment campaign, designed to force me out of the neighborhood. Karen began filing complaints with county offices, claiming my home office violated zoning laws, building codes, and tax regulations. Each complaint required my time and attention to address, even though they were uniformly dismissed as frivolous. She contacted my professional clients, attempting to convince them that I was operating illegally and unreliably. Most disturbing, she started documenting and photographing my daily activities with an obsessiveness that bordered on stalking. Every morning, Karen positioned herself strategically to observe and record my routine. She photographed delivery trucks, noted the timing of my garbage collection, and even documented when I retrieved my mail. She filed noise complaints about my air conditioning unit, claimed my outdoor lighting violated dark sky ordinances, and submitted formal challenges to my property tax assessment. The final escalation came when Karen contacted my mortgage lender, claiming that my home office activities violated the terms of my residential loan, and that the H.O.A. was pursuing legal action that could affect my property's marketability. This crossed from harassment into potential interference with my financial relationships, and I realized Karen had moved beyond petty power trips into behavior that could have serious legal consequences for her. That evening, I called Rebecca Martinez with a different type of request. Instead of defending against Karen's attacks, I wanted to explore whether her actions had created liability that we could address through appropriate legal channels. Rebecca's assessment was swift and definitive. What you're describing is a textbook case of harassment, intentional interference with business relationships, and potentially stalking. This woman has exposed herself to significant civil and criminal liability. Rebecca recommended documenting everything, while she researched the specific legal framework that would apply to Karen's conduct. But I had a different idea, inspired by my years of experience with municipal governance and development law. Rather than simply defending against Karen's attacks or pursuing damages for her harassment, I wanted to address the root cause of her behavior, her absolute conviction that she could wield H.O.A. authority without meaningful constraints or accountability. My research into Willow Creek Estate's governance structure revealed several interesting details about how our H.O.A. operated and where Karen's authority actually came from. Like most homeowner associations, ours was a nonprofit corporation governed by recorded covenants, state statutes, and its own bylaws and articles of incorporation. Karen's position as president gave her significant day-to-day authority, but that authority was constrained by legal requirements she'd been systematically ignoring. More intriguingly, I discovered that H.O.A. board members could be held personally liable for actions taken outside their authority, or in violation of their fiduciary duties to the association and its members. Karen's pattern of harassment, selective enforcement, and procedural violations wasn't just annoying. It was creating potential personal legal exposure that she seemed completely unaware of. The breakthrough came when I obtained copies of all formal complaints Karen had filed against me and other residents over the past 2 years. The pattern was unmistakable. Karen had been systematically targeting residents she perceived as challenging her authority, while ignoring identical violations by others. Mrs. Henderson's garden gnome citation came immediately after she questioned Karen's interpretation of landscaping rules. The Johnsons received their welcome mat violation the day after Mr. Johnson suggested the board needed more transparency. Most significantly, Karen's own property had multiple covenant violations that she'd never addressed or disclosed. Her fence exceeded height limits in 3 locations. Her landscaping included non-approved plant species. Most ironically, she'd been operating a small online retail business selling handmade crafts from her home for over a year, with packages regularly picked up by delivery services. Rebecca's legal analysis confirmed that Karen's selective enforcement pattern constituted a clear violation of her fiduciary duties as an H.O.A. board member. More importantly, her harassment campaign against me had crossed into criminal territory, specifically stalking and intentional interference with business relationships. We have grounds for both civil and criminal complaints. But given her escalating behavior, I think the criminal route might be more immediately effective in stopping the harassment. I spent the weekend documenting every interaction, complaint, and incident involving Karen over the past 6 months. The timeline revealed a clear escalation from petty enforcement to systematic harassment to potentially criminal conduct. Her surveillance activities alone constituted stalking under state law, and her contacts with my clients and mortgage lender demonstrated intentional interference with my business and financial relationships. Monday morning, I visited the county sheriff's office to file a formal criminal complaint against Karen for stalking and harassment. The investigating deputy, Officer Patricia Williams, was immediately interested in the case when I presented my documentation. We see a lot of H.O.A. disputes, but this level of surveillance and harassment is unusual. Most of these situations involve personality conflicts, but what you're describing sounds like systematic intimidation. Officer Williams reviewed my photographs, timeline, and copies of Karen's various complaints and communications. She was particularly concerned about Karen's pattern of photographing my home and daily activities, her contacts with third parties about my business, and her escalating threats about forced property sale. This definitely meets the criteria for stalking under state law. The pattern of unwanted contact, surveillance, and threats to your livelihood creates a clear case. I also provided Officer Williams with Rebecca's legal analysis documenting Karen's violations of H.O.A. procedures and her exposure to personal liability. This background helped establish that Karen's actions weren't legitimate covenant enforcement, but rather personal harassment designed to force my compliance with her demands. The criminal investigation moved quickly once Officer Williams interviewed other Willow Creek residents about their experiences with Karen. Mrs. Henderson, the Johnsons, and 3 other neighbors provided statements describing similar patterns of harassment, selective enforcement, and intimidating behavior. Several residents had security camera footage showing Karen surveilling their properties and photographing their homes without permission. Most damaging to Karen's position was the testimony from current and former H.O.A. board members. 2 board members confirmed that Karen had never sought authorization for her investigation of my business activities or her contacts with external agencies. A former board member revealed that Karen had privately bragged about her ability to force out residents who challenged her authority, describing specific tactics she'd used against previous homeowners. Officer Williams also discovered that Karen had filed false or misleading complaints with multiple county agencies, claiming authority she didn't possess and making representations about H.O.A. actions that had never been approved by the board. These false statements in official proceedings constituted additional criminal violations beyond the stalking and harassment charges. The arrest warrant was issued on a Friday afternoon, exactly 2 weeks after I'd filed my initial complaint. Officer Williams called to inform me that they'd be executing the warrant Monday morning and asked if I expected any unusual circumstances given Karen's personality and position in the community. I suggested they might want to coordinate with the H.O.A. management company to ensure proper procedures were followed if Karen tried to claim official immunity or authority. Monday morning arrived with the subtle drama that defines suburban justice. I was working in my home office when I noticed the sheriff's patrol car pull into Karen's driveway across the street. Officer Williams and a second deputy approached Karen's front door with the professional calm of experienced law enforcement officers executing routine legal process. Karen answered the door in her typical H.O.A. president uniform, blazer, clipboard, and an expression of authority that suggested she expected to be consulted about whatever neighborhood issue had brought law enforcement to her street. Her confidence was immediately visible even from my distant observation point. The conversation at Karen's door lasted approximately 3 minutes before her body language shifted dramatically. The clipboard fell from her hands as Officer Williams presented the arrest warrant and began explaining the charges. Karen's voice, usually commanding and precise, became shrill and desperate as she realized the officers weren't seeking her assistance but rather her surrender. There must be some mistake. I'm the H.O.A. president. I was just enforcing our community covenants. This is all a misunderstanding. Karen's protest carried across the quiet street as Officer Williams calmly explained her rights and the specific charges: stalking, harassment, intentional interference with business relationships, and filing false reports with government agencies. The handcuffs were applied with professional efficiency as Karen continued her increasingly frantic explanations about H.O.A. authority, community standards, and her responsibility to maintain neighborhood order. Her neighbors, drawn by the unusual morning activity, watched from windows and doorways as their imperious H.O.A. president was guided into the patrol car's back seat. As the patrol car pulled away from Karen's driveway, I watched her face in the rear window transform from outraged indignation to the beginning recognition that her absolute authority over Willow Creek Estates had just encountered the higher authority of actual law. The woman who'd spent months threatening me with legal consequences was now facing real legal consequences for her own conduct. But Karen's arrest was only the beginning of her accountability, not its conclusion. The criminal charges would require months to resolve, and her legal exposure extended far beyond the immediate stalking and harassment allegations. Rebecca Martinez had identified multiple civil violations that could result in significant personal financial liability, and the H.O.A. itself was now exposed to potential lawsuits from residents Karen had harassed. More immediately, Karen's arrest triggered an automatic review of her H.O.A. board position under the association's bylaws and state nonprofit corporation law. Convicted felons couldn't serve on H.O.A. boards, and even pending criminal charges created potential conflicts with her fiduciary duties. The remaining board members would need to address her status quickly to protect the association from additional liability. Tuesday evening brought the emergency H.O.A. board meeting that would determine Karen's immediate future as president. The community center was packed with residents who'd heard about Monday's arrest and wanted to understand its implications for neighborhood governance. The remaining 4 board members looked distinctly uncomfortable as they called the meeting to order without their usual leader. Vice President Margaret Thompson read a prepared statement explaining that board members facing criminal charges related to their H.O.A. duties created potential liability for the association and conflicts with their fiduciary responsibilities. The board had consulted with their attorney and determined that Karen's continued service during pending criminal proceedings would be inappropriate and potentially harmful to all homeowners. The vote to remove Karen as president and suspend her board membership was unanimous among the 4 remaining members. Margaret Thompson was elected interim president, and the board committed to conducting a comprehensive review of all enforcement actions taken during Karen's tenure to identify potential procedural violations or discriminatory patterns. Karen wasn't present for this meeting. She was presumably dealing with criminal defense attorneys and the logistics of responding to multiple charges. But her absence spoke volumes about how quickly absolute authority could evaporate when subjected to legal accountability. The woman who dominated neighborhood governance for years was now legally prohibited from attending the meeting that removed her from power. Wednesday brought the news I'd been expecting. Karen's attorney had contacted Rebecca Martinez seeking to discuss resolution of potential civil claims related to the harassment and stalking incident. Criminal defense attorneys typically want to minimize their clients' exposure to additional litigation, and Karen's conduct had created substantial civil liability alongside the criminal charges. Rebecca's assessment was that Karen faced potential damages for intentional infliction of emotional distress, interference with business relationships, invasion of privacy, and violation of my civil rights under state anti-harassment statutes. The total exposure could easily reach 6 figures, particularly given Karen's documented pattern of targeting multiple residents and her apparent financial ability to pay significant damages. But I had a different proposal for Karen's attorney, one inspired by my years of experience with municipal accountability and governance reform. Rather than pursuing maximum financial damages, I wanted Karen to experience meaningful consequences that addressed the root cause of her behavior, her fundamental misunderstanding of authority, accountability, and the rule of law. I proposed that Karen accept responsibility for her conduct through a comprehensive accountability process that included restitution to all affected residents, community service focused on civil rights education, and permanent resignation from any H.O.A. leadership positions. Most importantly, she would need to publicly acknowledge her violations of residents' rights and her misuse of H.O.A. authority. The negotiation process took 2 weeks, during which Karen's criminal defense attorney clearly explained her legal exposure and the strength of the evidence against her. The stalking and harassment charges were supported by extensive documentation, multiple witness statements, and physical evidence including photographs and recorded communications. Her chances of avoiding conviction at trial were minimal, and the civil liability could be financially devastating. Karen's acceptance of the accountability agreement was delivered through her attorney without any direct communication. She would plead guilty to reduced misdemeanor charges, pay restitution to affected residents, complete community service with a civil rights organization, and resign permanently from H.O.A. leadership. Most significantly, she would provide written acknowledgement of her misconduct and formal apologies to all residents she'd harassed. The final H.O.A. board meeting of Karen's era took place on a Thursday evening 3 weeks after her arrest. Margaret Thompson, now serving as permanent president, read Karen's written resignation and formal apology to the assembled residents. Karen's statement acknowledged that she'd exceeded her authority, violated residents' rights, and created liability for the association through her selective enforcement and harassment tactics. Karen wasn't present for this final accounting of her leadership, but her written words captured the complete reversal of her position. I acknowledge that my actions as H.O.A. president exceeded my authority under our covenants and state law. I violated the rights of community residents through selective enforcement, harassment, and unauthorized surveillance. I accept full responsibility for my conduct and apologize to all residents who were affected by my misuse of authority. The new board announced comprehensive reforms designed to prevent future abuse of H.O.A. authority. All enforcement actions would require board approval. Residents would have clear appeal processes for any violations. Most importantly, board members would receive annual training on their legal duties and the limits of H.O.A. authority. As I walked home from that final meeting, I reflected on how completely the situation had transformed. 3 months earlier, Karen had been the undisputed authority figure in Willow Creek Estates, wielding covenant enforcement like a personal weapon against residents who dared question her judgment. Her threat to force the sale of my property had seemed both credible and terrifying given her apparent immunity from accountability. But Karen's absolute confidence in her authority had also been her fatal weakness. She'd escalated from petty harassment to serious criminal conduct because she'd never encountered meaningful resistance or consequences. Her assumption that H.O.A. president meant unlimited power had led her to violate laws she didn't even realize existed. The criminal justice system had provided the accountability that neighborhood governance couldn't deliver. Karen's stalking and harassment weren't just annoying behavior but actual crimes with real penalties. Her misuse of H.O.A. authority wasn't just poor leadership, but potential civil rights violations that created personal legal liability. 6 months later, Karen's house went up for sale with a discreet sign that avoided drawing attention to the circumstances behind her departure. New owners moved in during the fall, and the neighborhood returned to the quiet suburban routine that most residents had always preferred. The new H.O.A. board operated with transparency and respect for residents' rights, proving that effective governance didn't require intimidation or harassment. I continued my consulting practice from my home office without further interference, working with technology companies and occasionally helping other HOAs develop more professional and legally compliant governance practices. Rebecca Martinez referred several cases of HOA abuse, and I discovered a meaningful niche helping residents understand their rights and hold their associations accountable. But the most satisfying outcome was the transformation of Willow Creek Estates from Karen's personal kingdom into a genuine community. Residents no longer walked on eggshells around covenant enforcement. Board meetings became collaborative discussions rather than demonstrations of authority. The neighborhood finally achieved the harmony and mutual respect that Karen had always claimed to be protecting. The final irony was that Karen's own obsession with rules and authority had provided the framework for her accountability. The same legal system she'd threatened to use against me had ultimately been used to address her own violations. Her misunderstanding of authority had created the evidence trail that supported criminal charges and civil liability. As I locked my mailbox after retrieving the day's correspondence, I noticed the new H.O.A. newsletter announcing upcoming community events and volunteer opportunities. The tone was welcoming and inclusive, emphasizing resident participation rather than compliance and enforcement. It was exactly the kind of community communication that Karen would have dismissed as weak and ineffective. But effectiveness, I'd learned, wasn't measured by fear and intimidation. True authority came from respect, transparency, and accountability, concepts that Karen had never understood despite her years of wielding power over our neighborhood. Her downfall had been as swift and complete as her rise to dominance, proving that even the most seemingly untouchable local authority figures were subject to the rule of law. The woman who tried to evict me for operating a legal home office had instead been arrested, prosecuted, and permanently removed from any position of authority over our community, all because she'd refused to recognize the limits of her power and the rights of the residents she'd been elected to serve. What goes around comes around, as Mrs. Henderson had observed with obvious satisfaction during Karen's final board meeting. Karen's shocked expression when Officer Williams had presented that arrest warrant would remain my most vivid memory of our entire conflict. The precise moment when absolute authority met absolute accountability, and authority lost.